turn tonight to Philippians chapter 2, and I want to focus on the great passage from verse 5 downwards, which draws our attention in a very special way to the heart of Jesus. We've heard that phrase a moment ago in our brother's prayer, and it's very appropriate indeed to this evening's message. The passage is well known to us, but I want to spend a moment or two setting it in context. And that is given to us in the opening 4 verses of the chapter. It is very interesting indeed to me that this statement on Christology is occasioned by a very mundane problem in an infant church. And because of that problem, Paul expatiates very, very profoundly and wide-rangingly on the glory of the Saviour. And it is a superb example of the intimate connection between practice and doctrine. The situation, I'm afraid, is sadly all too familiar. This church at Philippi was in many ways a model community. It was fully involved in Paul's evangelism. It was blessed with a large degree of harmony and brotherly and sisterly love. And yet, even in this church, under Paul's own foundational leadership, there were tensions between the various members. And these tensions arose from lack of unanimity and lack, perhaps even more fundamentally, of mutual respect. We see in verse 3 that Paul puts those things before us very explicitly. He speaks of selfish ambition and vain conceit. And he speaks in verse 4 of people who look to their own interests. It really is a very familiar problem. And I suppose that in a nutshell, the issue is that there were in the church at Philippi people who thought they were somebody. They thought they were of some importance and some consequence. We don't know who they were. Perhaps they were bishops and deacons. Paul mentions them. Perhaps they were those who took the initiative in evangelism. Perhaps they were simply the older and more mature believers. But they thought that they had certain rights and were entitled to a certain kind of respect. And they wanted people to know how important they were. And out of this arose the pursuit of their own interests, and as a consequence, great damage to the Church of Jesus. I didn't try to moralize from the passage. It's true, I guess, that all disunity in God's church is a consequence of the thirst for power and recognition and control on the part of individuals and groups. And here it is before us already in the church at Philippi. And Paul responds to it not simply by giving some critique or some admonition or solemn threat or warning. He responds in this astonishing way by going on to give us, in summary, a statement of the glory of the Lord Jesus. But it's important to notice where all that starts in verse 5. Your attitude, he says. And that covers in the original a verb which simply asks them to think in a certain way. Think this which Christ also thought. And what he's saying is that the problem is one of attitude or one of thought. The problem lies in the mind. And so often that's the way it is in the church. It's the way we think. And I don't mean the way that we think when we're engaged in hard academic research or logical analysis, but our instinctive assumptions, the way that we take things for granted, our operating set of standards. That's what the problem is. It's attitude. It's the way our minds actually react to certain things, the way our minds work. Because so few of us, in fact, have learned to think Christianly. In fact, I shouldn't say so few. None of us, I guess, has learned to think Christianly in a consistent and unfailing way. But Paul is taking us back to this, to the way that we think. The assumptions and instincts and judgments that we carry around with us, which we apply almost blindly sometimes in various situations. We have excuses, explanations, we have self-defense mechanisms, we have certain assertions and claims that we make, and we take them all for granted. And Paul is saying to us really, well, let's take all this mental baggage, all this talk about our own needs, our own interests, our own rights. Let's go with these to the cross of Calvary, and let's see what they look like. You know, they're normal human thoughts. You can't expect me to put up with that. You can't be surprised if I did that. I couldn't ignore that. I couldn't forgive that. Well, let's go, Paul says, with all of that to the cross. Think the way Jesus thought. Now, in the passage which follows, which is described variously by scholars as a great hymn or a great confession, there are in fact three movements. And I'm going to just remind you of them and then more or less abandon that structure. The first movement or moment is the pre-existence of Christ, who already existing in the form of God, or who being in very nature God. That's the pre-existent Christ. And then there is the humiliated Christ, the one who made himself nothing and took the form of a servant. And then thirdly, in verse 9, there is the exalted Christ. And so we have within these few verses this whole broad scope, this great sweep of the history of our Savior. Pre-existence, humiliation, and exaltation. But I want to focus on this other point I raised earlier on this question of attitude. The way that Jesus actually thought. The kind of mind that the Savior had. And there are two great moments in that mind of Christ defined for us in this chapter, in this passage. The first is in verse 6. He did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing. That's the first thing about the way that Jesus thought. The second thing is in verse 8. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself. Now there are two great instances of the mindset of Jesus, and I want to turn to them for a moment. Take the first one. The outstanding thing about this first one is that it refers to the pre-existent Christ, to the mindset that lay behind the incarnation itself. It is the mindset really of the pre-incarnate eternal Son of God. And in that pre-incarnate state, being in very nature God, he made a certain choice, and he showed a certain attitude. Now, we're not here talking about a man, not even about God incarnate. We're talking about eternal God, the eternal Godhead in the form of a Son. We're talking about a divine choice. We're talking about an attitude on the part of God himself. We're talking about the way that God, that is God the Son, actually confronted a certain problem and how he thought in response to that problem. We're told that he was in very nature God. Now, the precise language of the original is already existing in the form of God. That is, before he came to this world, before he even made the decision to come to this world, he was already in existence. And he would not have come or made the choice if he had not been already in existence. This is the background to the choice he made, who already existing. And he already existed, Paul says, in the form of God. This word here is found in many English words. The Greek word that's used here, the Greek word morphe, it's found, for example, in morphology and all the various words that are linked with that particular form, that word morphe. Who being in very morphe God. We could almost say, in fact, that his morphology was a divine morphology. Now, this word, as it happens, is linked to a series of other words in biblical Greek. If I could just itemize them for a moment, there is the word image, there is the word likeness, there is the word glory, and there is the word form. All these words are very closely linked. Now, some of the older scholars drew a very sharp distinction between form on the one side and the word likeness on the other side. That, I think, was a mistake. And I say that because we know that in the Greek Old Testament, the same Hebrew words are translated interchangeably by those 4 Greek words. I hope this all this word business isn't too much of a bore for you. But if we go back to Genesis, we are told that God made man in his image and according to his own likeness. Image and likeness. These are 2 very important Hebrew words that define man's relation to God. And these 2 words are translated interchangeably, sometimes by likeness, sometimes by image, sometimes by form, and sometimes by glory. And from that, scholars conclude that the word Paul uses here is synonymous with such words as likeness and image and glory. And in a way, the point of that whole group of words is almost visual. It's what would be seen, only of course that God doesn't have a form. But it's as if these words presuppose an observer. And you can imagine, for example, the angels. And they looked at God the Father. Well, the eyes of angels, of course, themselves had no bodies. But they looked at God and they took note of what God was like. And then they looked at God the Son and they saw the exact same likeness. They saw the same form and the same image, and they saw the same glory. The glory of the one was as the glory of the other. You couldn't tell them apart in terms of glory. The Son was as glorious as the Father. He had the same form, the same morphology as God the Father. And he had that, of course, because He was the same as God in nature. Now the word nature, which the NIV uses, is not in the Greek, because there is a specific Greek word for nature, the word physis, from which our word physical comes. A very interesting thing that the old Puritans often spoke of the new birth as physical, because they used that word physical very much in the sense of the Greek word physis. It was a change of nature. Physics is in fact a modern word for what used to be called natural philosophy. So the word nature isn't in the text at all. What's in the text is the word form. But of course, where the form and majesty, where the glory of God is, there is the form of God. We could say here, who being in very glory God. He had the glory of God. In fact, he was the glory of God. You could see the glory of God in his face. And you see, you link that to your whole context, because the problem at Philippi was how dreadfully important all these bishops and deacons and professors, how important they all were, you see. And they all knew how important they were. They all thought they had a magnificent form. They all thought they were glorious. They all thought they were somebody. And that's why Paul does this amazing thing. Paul goes to the one really great and important somebody. And he contrasts the way that the eternal somebody thought with the way that all these little minuscule somebodies in the churches were behaving. And how different the thoughts of the great somebody were from the thoughts of all the little Lilliputian somebodies who were mucking up the churches of Christ then, as perhaps we ourselves do today. So that's what Paul is saying. He's starting here with this great somebody who being in very nature God. Well, you see, at Philippi, all the wee somebodies, they were clinging to their right. They were grasping at all their own privileges. That's mine. I do that. I am Judas. I am so and so. And they were grasping it all. They knew their precise place in the pecking order. But, says Paul, look at the great somebody, at the real somebody, what he did. He did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or to be clutched to himself or clung to, hang on to. Well, you see, he was equal with God. He was in the form and in the glory of God, but he didn't cling to it. He didn't say to it, that's mine. He didn't say, I mustn't let go of it, I can't let go of it. Now, it may seem a bit odd to us how this could be. The point fundamentally is, he had the glory of God. He had the equality with God, but he did not cling to it. Now, you see, if he had clung to it, he would have said, when the Father suggested his going to earth, well, Abba, I will go, but of course, if I go, I'll have to take my glory with me. And if I go, we'll need to make very careful arrangements as to where I'm going to be born and where I'm going to live, and what kind of followers I'm going to have, and what kind of immunities I'm going to have, and so on and so forth. I would need, he would say, certain guarantees, and I would need to have some kind of halo so that folk would know who I am. And I would need to be born to the accompaniment of thousands of trumpets, and I would need to be followed by hosts of angels, and I would need the mountains to shake, the sky turn red, and the whole thing to be a brilliant pyrotechnical display. Perhaps that folk will know just how important I am, that it's me that's coming, and not just some angel or some even some archangel, but your own son. You know, I want to cling. There has to be the glory. He could have said, of course, I won't go at all. Or he could have said, I'll go but. Or he could have said, I'll go, but not to be born in a manger. And not to be brought up in Nazareth. And not to live without a home. worse than the birds of the air and the foxes. I wouldn't agree to that, he would say. And of course, the very, very thought that he would go through Gethsemane and go through Calvary, there could be none of that if he had clung to be equal with God, clung to his equality and told them, like the Philippians, I'm a bishop, I'm a professor, I'm the oldest Christian here. If he had had that attitude, Paul says, he would never have come. He did not cling to his position, did not assert his rights. And you can imagine, what a difference it would make today. I don't say if everybody in the world was driven by this principle of renouncing his own rights, but if every Christian, if every evangelical, if every born-again person were driven by this philosophy, that they should not cling to their own rights or assert their own entitlements, how different our homes would be, and how different our workplaces and our politics, and how different our very churches would be if we're all controlled by this philosophy of renouncing our own rights. Well, that's what Jesus did. And then Paul says, instead of insisting on his rights and clinging to his own privileges and prerogatives, he made himself nothing. He made himself nothing. Now, the original language here is very, very strong. And it says literally that Christ emptied himself. He emptied himself. And there have been theologians who have taken the view that this means that when Christ came into the world, he emptied himself of Godhead. And that while he was on earth, he had ceased to be God. Now, of course, that is manifestly impossible because God can't commit suicide, and I'm not going into all the details of that theory at all, but there is a very, very interesting thing, in the construction of this whole statement, and it is this. Literally what Paul says is, he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. He emptied himself by taking. There is no word, you see, about what Christ laid aside. The wonderful thing is what Christ took. And in a way, you see, he belittled himself by adding to himself. He subtracted from himself by adding to himself. He made himself less by taking something. That's what Paul is saying. He emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. Paul doesn't say a word about Jesus renouncing or giving up the form of God. He speaks of what Jesus took, what the Son of God took. The Son of God took the form of a servant. It was what he took that detracted from him. Just as before he had the glory of the Almighty Maker of heaven and earth, the form of God, so now he has the form of a servant. And it is, of course, more powerful than that, because Paul says he took the form of a slave. The angels had looked at him and they saw the glory of God. And now they looked and they saw the form of a slave. Remember that in that world, a slave had no rights. And you may think, well, that's an interesting proposition, and you may think it's nothing but that. But have you ever pondered just how absolute that utter rightlessness actually was? In our own modern democracy, there is this tremendous passion for rights. We now have, in Scotland and Northern Ireland, we have a Bill of Rights. You have now your own publicly acknowledged rights. We clamour for a Freedom of Information Act because the public have a right to know. Rights. Patients Charter, Consular's Charter, rights all the time. It's rights. We have women's rights, we have students' rights, we have children's rights, we have employees' rights, we have prisoners' rights, we have everybody's rights, you see. And then we see this, we see the Son of God becoming a slave. Now, the Son of God as a slave, he couldn't own property, he couldn't marry, he couldn't legally have children. If he began them, and they were born, they weren't his, nor were they the mother's. It could be bought or sold in the marketplace. A slave had no right to a fair trial, or to any kind of trial. His master had absolute dominion and sovereignty over his life and death. Absolutely no rights. It was part of the whole drama of the cross that only a non-citizen, a slave, a free man could not be crucified. You had to be a no person to be crucified. And that's what Jesus became, a no person. He was absolutely, utterly rightless. Had he had rights, even civil rights, he could not have been crucified. Only somebody without rights could be crucified. And that's what Jesus became. He became a slave, somebody with no entitlements. Now, that is in some ways, I think, interesting enough. But you see, all the time you're thinking of this wonderful man who engaged in such an act of self-denial, this man. But the whole point of what Paul is saying is this: it was not a man who did this. It was the Son of God who did it. It was God the Son. You see, all this happened before Christ became a man. It was as God that he didn't cling to his rights. It was as God that he made himself nothing. It was as God that he took the form of a servant. And I don't think there is anything in the whole Bible so difficult for you to believe as this. Because it goes against all that we think about God. All our own instincts. God giving up his rights. You see, we have been drilled and schooled, especially as Reformed people, in this idea that all that matters to God is his glory, and God will do anything for his glory, and God is obsessed with his own rights. Now, somewhere there is a grain of truth in that. But it's not the truth brought out here. The truth brought out here is that a divine person did not cling to his own rights, did not pursue his own interests, but made himself a no person, made himself a person who had no rights. And that is what he did, not as a man or as incarnate, but that's what he did as God. In other words, what this is saying to us is this: have you any idea how God thinks? Yes, you say, I know how God thinks. God is angry with sin, God is jealous of his rights, and God always protects his own glory, and God stands up for his own prerogatives, and don't you mess with God. And what is being said here is, do you know how God thinks? God does not cling to his rights, doesn't insist on it, doesn't insist that people must know who he is and how important he is. God makes himself nothing. He lets himself be misunderstood, lets himself be unrecognized, lets his glory be hidden. That's the way that God thinks. Now, I'm not saying that it is the whole truth, but it is a mightily important part of the truth. It was the person who was in the form of God, who has not yet become man. It is that person who made all these decisions and who showed this astonishing attitude. And that means that at the most obvious level, it is not inconsistent with the nature of God to renounce your own glory, to pursue interests other than your own interests, and to be willing to be a no person. It can't be inconsistent with what God is, because if it were, God wouldn't have done it. But God did this, who being in the form of God, made himself nothing. And he hasn't yet become man, but in the form of God, when he had only one nature, the divine nature, he made that choice, thought this way while he was God and while he was only God. That's the way that God thinks. And I would even want to suggest to you that not only is this not inconsistent with the nature of God, but it is the greatest window we have into the way that God thinks. How does the Almighty think? That great mind. That mind which holds more information than all the great intellects of the world put together, and that holds and stores and organizes more information than all the computers we can begin to imagine from here to doomsday. How does he think? What kind of mind does God have? It's a mind, Paul says, that is not obsessed with its own interests, that does not cling to its own rights and entitlements, that does not insist on recognition, that is willing to make himself nothing. That's what God did. And it was as God that he did it. And I share with you all your inbuilt reluctance to believe it, because it is counterintuitive. And in some ways I'm asking myself and you, when you talk to your children about God, to little ones perhaps, what image do you present? What language do you use? What concept do you want them to have? Someone to be afraid of? Someone who's angry when they do wrong? Someone who's always finding fault with them? Somebody obsessed with his own glory? What form does God have? What form does he have? Can we get across to the children from the very earliest age that God does not, this one who doesn't cling to his rights. He doesn't say to his wee sister, that's mine. This God who makes himself nothing. All this then is the way that God thought, the Son of God thought in his pre-existent state. That was his attitude. And then see the same person in verse 8. He is the same person still, but now he is in appearance as a man. He has become incarnate. He has taken human nature. And look at that word appearance, and you say, well, here again is a visual kind of word that again presupposes an observer. And the angels used to look and they would see the form of God, and now they look and they see the form of a man. They see somebody who looks utterly and totally human, and that's all. There is nothing in his earthly existence or appearance to suggest anything but that he is human. So here he is. And he is still thinking. and he still has an attitude. But his attitude has not changed. He is still thinking in the same way as he thought before he took human nature. He still thinks the way he thought when he was God, and when he was only God. What does he do? He humbled himself. Now that is absolutely remarkable. Because here he was, you see, he had taken this gigantic step from heaven to earth. There was never a come down in human history, or in human imagination, or in the angel's wildest dreams like this. This astonishing contraction. This person who had been in the form of God, who had come and taken this human form and was a little baby in a manger in Bethlehem. He had humbled himself, or so you would have thought. And you would say, well, he has gone so low, it's beyond belief. And he has gone so low in this one great step, joining himself to our finite created nature in a low condition. He couldn't go any lower. You would think that in one step of incarnation, he had encompassed all the humiliation that was possible. That he had crammed all the self-abnegation and all the self-denial conceivable into that one great step. But no. Here he is now, humbled to a human condition. And he says, I must go lower still. And he sets out on this great journey, this humbled one sets out on this great journey towards humiliation. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself. The glory of it is this, that his being in appearance as a man was already a humiliation, and humiliation enough. But he wasn't content with that. He didn't, as God, he didn't insist on his rights. And now, as man, he doesn't insist on his rights. But he goes off further and further into humiliation. And he sets out. He becomes obedient. That was a servant's responsibility and duty, to obey. So he obeys. But you know, there's obedience and obedience. There is the obedience of a son to a father, of a prime minister to a king, of a nation to its lawmakers, of an apprentice to his master. There are all kinds of obediences. But here is an obedience which is unto death. The command in a way is to die, to lay down his life for the sinful sons of men. That's his ministry. That's the assignment that God has given to him. And he could have said, look, I am the Son of God. I am the Prince of Life. I am the living one. And I have a right to life, and I have a right to live. But no, he sets out from the manger in Bethlehem. And that was low enough. He had been at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Now he's in the manger. But the manger wasn't low enough. He had to go through Gethsemane. And he had to go on to the cross of Calvary, ever lower and lower and lower. And as we've seen, I'm sure, time and again, even the cross itself was a journey from the third hour to the ninth hour. All those long hours. He was going lower and lower, and at last he was forsaken by God. And what the angels were thinking doesn't bear contemplating, of course, but here he was. They must have thought at every stage, he can't go any lower. They must have thought that things can't get any worse. they must have thought, well, surely he'll draw the line somewhere and say, I have my rights, or appeal to some kind of justice, and maybe invoke some great Bill of Rights, and say, look, you can't do that to me. You can't do this to the Son of God. You can't do this to an innocent man, he might have said. You can't do this to a Jew. You can't do this to a human being. You can't beat him to a pulp. You can't do that to a human being. He could have said a whole lot of things. But he said none of them. Absolutely none of them. He just kept on going lower. And as Bonhoeffer said, he allowed himself, the Son of God, I'm going to say, God and the Son, God allowed himself to be pushed out of his own world onto the cross. God allowed himself to be pushed out of his own world onto the cross. Now you might ring that with all kinds of theological qualifications and clarifications, but at the moment I'm not hugely interested in them. I want to let the truth have its own force. And after all, the basic thrust of the whole passage is ethical. It's about, if things go on this way, there'll be no place for me. If things go on this way, I'll have nowhere to hide. If things go on this way, I'll have nothing left. And so we say, well, we must draw the line somewhere. And I'm asking, you see, where did Jesus draw the line? Where did he say to the forces of evil and of injustice, hitherto or thus far shalt thou come, but no further? No further. Stop. Did he say stop? Did he say no further? Well, you see, he didn't stop at the mention and say, that's far enough. And he didn't stop at Gethsemane and say, that's far enough. And he didn't even stop at the crucifixion and say, that's enough. Because he had to go on to that very point where he lost the most important right of all, the right to a hearing from God himself, the right to cry to God and be heard. He lost the presence of God on the face of God and communion with God. And I want to say again that for the moment the ethics are more important than theology. This demand, this way that Jesus thought, where literally he himself did not matter, where his own rights, and sometimes what's more difficult for us, where our own needs, his own needs, were of no consequence. His own needs were of no consequence. And it is utterly and totally limitless. This is a man who would not have used his position or his influence to mitigate any of the discomforts and injustices of his own existence. And yet, you and I instinctively think that there is nothing wrong with using those powers, those influences, those rights that we have to mitigate and modify our own lives on earth. And there is a marvelous story in Bonhoeffer's letters from prison, which I may have spoken of before. In the early years of his imprisonment, or the early months of it, Bonhoeffer's parents were still very important figures in German life and culture. And they had influence. And through this influence, word came that they would move Bonhoeffer from a particular cell which was extremely hot, like a furnace, and put him somewhere more comfortable. And of course, this was great news, because he was finding it really tough going. Here was an aristocrat, one of Germany's elite, pampered, no previous experience of physical hardship or deprivation or confinement, and here he was being roasted to death in this concrete cell. So the great news came that he'd be shifted to a cooler cell. But he realized that if he left the cell, somebody else would be put into it. And if he went to a cooler cell, somebody else was being put out of it. And so he said no. And he stayed where he was. Now, in some ways, the important point there is not Bonhoeffer's action. It is the way he thought. That it occurred to him at all. Because it has become so uncharacteristic of us to think in those ways. We do use our power, our influence, to protect ourselves, to secure privilege for ourselves, which at one level is okay, but it's at the expense of others, and some other poor soul has to carry what we secure immunity from. So here was Jesus, humbled to this almost impossible low, where he was the child in the manger, and then setting out into an even greater humiliation down towards Calvary. And of course, when he got there was a complete eclipsing of his glory. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew how important he was. Nobody knew that this was the man who had told those great parables, who had preached those great sermons, who had such a loyal following, who had worked such mighty miracles, who was God's own Son. Nobody knew. They were laughing at him, mocking at this ridiculous figure on the cross. He was a nobody. He was a no person. And bear in mind, he was only about 32. Bear in mind that he was dying in human terms as an abject failure. He had achieved nothing. He had written no books. He had founded no school. He had gathered no great band of followers, a few dozen peasants, and that was all. And now that was it. It was over. It was finished. It was all ending in this tragedy. Just imagine. If you want to know how low he had come, just imagine how his mother felt. Or how you would have thought or felt if it were your son. Part of the terror of it, you know, is the way that Jesus' humiliation involved humiliation and pain for others, particularly for his mother. But there he was, the way he was thinking, you see. He didn't claim his rights. And when he was humbled, he didn't say enough, that's humiliation enough. But down he went lower and lower and lower. Now, I think that we could be tempted to spend far too much time qualifying that. You know, people often think that the Pharisees, that they were very, very strict. But the whole genius of Pharisaism was evasion. If a Pharisee saw a rule or a law or a principle, he said instinctively, what are the exceptions? When does this not apply? That is a very deep human instinct. And you could say to me, well, when does this not apply? When can we cling to our rights? When can we stand up for ourselves? I don't know when we ever can. I don't know if we ever can. Doesn't mean that I don't do it, because I have all your instincts. But I'm asking, would Jesus have done it? This man, don't treat me as a nobody. Don't treat me as a no person. Don't treat me as if I wasn't here, as I wasn't there. Don't ignore me. Don't trample on my rights. And that's what Jesus did. And within the confines of this passage, I see no limit to it. And yet, it's not about him in the first instance, in the actual rhetorical structures of this passage. It's about you. Your attitude. You think the way that Jesus thought. Now, I'm in a dilemma as to whether I want to go on to the exaltation, which takes me beyond, in a way, what Jesus' thinking. But I'll just raise two things before I leave it for the moment. One is that when it comes to the exaltation, Jesus does not exalt himself. You say to me, but afterwards, things changed, and there was a resurrection, and there was the ascension, and there was the assumption of heavenly power and sovereignty. Yes, there was, says Paul. But that wasn't his action, that was God's action. God highly exalted him. His own action was to go towards the execution chamber, towards the gallows hill, and lay down his life, and end his career, and die in disgrace, and die in ignominy. And all he could do was say, Abba, into your hands I commit my spirit. He was surrendering his life, surrendering his career, his prospects, his reputation, everything. And if there were to be any kind of vindication or restoration, it was out of his hands. It is a remarkable change in the subject. This is a piece of grammar again. I'm sorry about that, but he made himself nothing. He humbled himself, but he did not exalt himself to the highest place. He did not, and in my view he could not. It was God the Father who did it. He committed himself to Abba on the cross. So it was God who exalted him. In a way, you see, and you must forgive me if I'm still wrestling with much of what this is trying to say to me. It was a laying down of control. We want to be in control. And it is very, very, very difficult to give up control. For some, it's especially difficult. For me, to surrender myself to medical procedures, even dentists, the loss of control, I find that hard. But this loss of control, the surrender of control on this tremendous scale, I lay down my life. He laid down his life. And he laid it down, you see, at a psychological point where he had still not achieved significance, done nothing, achieved nothing at a human level. To lay it down there at that point, but that's what he did. He surrendered control. He gave himself up. He went to the cross. And we have to hope that when the time comes for us to surrender control, that we may have the grace to do so. But in a way, by becoming Christians, we have done that. We commit our spirits to God that very day. We say to God, you take over. So that's what's happening here. The exaltation is unlike the humiliation. The humiliation was his own work, all by himself. But the exaltation is not his. God exalted him. And the other glorious point here in verse 11 is what he does with that exaltation. You see, if you take the exaltation from verse 9 down to the middle of verse 11, it all shows Jesus so absolutely glorious. God has hyper-exalted him. And God has given him the name that is above every name. And at this name, every knee is bowing and every tongue is singing and confessing his glory. In heaven and earth and under the earth. And you would think, now, here is recognition for Jesus. Here is acclamation of Jesus. Here is now the focal point and the theme of the whole symphony of creation. No, says Paul, to the glory of God the Father. His exaltation is dedicated to God the Father. His glory is dedicated to God the Father. So that even at the point of exaltation there is still the self-denial on Jesus' part. He doesn't say, Abba, since I've been so good and since I've done so much, Abba, it's all about my glory now, Abba, isn't it? All about my glory. I'm the important one now, Abba. It's me the angels will love and sing about now, isn't it? It's all about me. He doesn't say that. He humbled himself in the interests of others. And he uses his exaltation in the interests of others. And you might link that, you see, eventually with the great insights offered to us in the Gospel of John, chapter 17. They're quite remarkable, although very familiar words. Glorify your Son, that your Son also may glorify you. Abba, you give me glory, and with that glory I will glorify you. I will not use my glory for myself, but for you. And Abba, you have given him power or authority over all flesh, and that's glorious, so that he would give eternal life to as many as you have given him. What does he do with his glory? He glorifies God the Father. What does he do with his power? He gives life to others. That's what he does with it. Now, at some levels, I think eventually, this whole thing is utterly terrifying. Because God is still working out the implications for us of Christ-likeness. And how is it going to unfold, this great discipline to which God is putting us, teaching us to think like Jesus, to deny ourselves, to renounce our rights, to be willing to be nothing, to have no claims, no expectations. How on earth today, in the light of this, can we ever turn to God and say, in the deepest and bitterest of our pains, why me, Lord? Why you do this to me? Now I know we do it, and there is space in the gospel for us to do it. And yet if we think the way Jesus thought, I've struggled to express what I'm trying to say in this area so often. But it seems to me that Christians sometimes think that because they're Christians, they're going to get praise and recognition and honor and acclamation. Because at a certain level, you see, we know that what is good deserves to be praised. I am good, therefore I ought to be praised. I deserve praise. I think that last night we had somebody called Posh Spice switching on Edinburgh street lights. And if I think about it, I think that is utterly absurd. That society's scale of values is such that that is the kind of person who is esteemed and honored, while Christ is laughed at and despised. And I still think that. But still, I should have expected it. Because they never asked Christ who was the light to switch on the lights. They nailed him to the tree. But Christians think, oh, we should be the ones switching on the lights. Why don't they have a bishop or a clergyman or a professor doing that rather than Posh Spice? But Christians ought to be nailed to the tree, not switching on the lights. And in most of the world's countries, that's the way it is. We have in this part of the world a moment of respite. But it is the costlessness of our discipleship that's exceptional, not the costliness of discipleship in Afghanistan or Pakistan. Well, I'm going to